we've got... Ciao. How are you? You? Good to see you. We've got a little bit of F3 noises. They're just they're getting ready for their next session, so they're going to come into centres around this part of the car, the Formula 1 steering wheel, which we have over here for you. We're going to have this all weekend, so if you do want to get a photo with the Formula 1 steering wheel, we'll have this available for you. Alright, well Mark, how about, before it gets too noisy downstairs, firstly, welcome. Good to see you. How about you talk us through some of the technology that we see on board? Obviously there's been so much development from when we first got into Formula 1 in 1950, just a wooden and steel steering wheel, and now that we see this very complex instrument in front of us, and it's all there for the driver to operate while they're trying to drive a very, very busy lap, especially if you're on a lap around the Hungarian. There's not a lot of time to relax. What are the standout features of this year's 2022 Ferrari steering wheel?
Yeah, there's not much more space to put any more buttons. You know, they call it, in Italian they call it manettinos. So the manettino is the rotary switch, which that was invented by Ferrari in the road cars. I don't know what was the first model, it was something like the 355, something like that, which is nice that Ferraris, again, you know, it invents something in Formula 1, and they are the first ones to bring it into the road car, like the paddle shift in the back, because the paddle shift in the back is exactly like a normal road car Ferrari. With the left one you go down on the gears, with the right one you go up on the gears. In the lower part you have the clutch, as we can see here, the clutch, which is quite difficult to start on because you want to react very quickly to the lights, but you don't want to react too fast, otherwise you get some wheel spin. Remember that the Formula 1 cars have no traction control, and also the gears are not automatic upshift, so if you don't change gears, it goes on the limiter. That's why it's called semi-automatic. You have the paddle shift, but you have to decide to change gears. Now, as you can see, if you look at it, there's two buttons that stand out. There's two buttons that are much bigger than all of them. Actually, are the ones that you use the least. However, they are very big because you don't want to miss them, which is the neutral and the pit limit. So you only use them probably once on the race, you know, for a pit stop. But it's so important to not miss the pit limit before the line that decides pit limit speed, and before that it's free. So the driver actually also, if you notice on the steering wheel, it has a little knob in the central, because the driver, what the drivers do is before they come in the pits, they don't look at the button. They just feel and they say, okay, yeah, that's the one. No other button has this knob, only the radio one. So that's something so that the driver, before coming in the pits, without looking, senses the button and feels sure that that's the pit limit button. And also, it's the only button that it's protected, because you want to make sure you don't press it by mistake, because if you press it anywhere else, the car will go into the pit limit in a slow speed corner. So, as I say, very big, you don't use them very much, but very important not to miss them. Now, here in the central, it's like a normal phone, you know, there's a lot of information, the lap time, the split time, very important, keeps telling the driver plus or minus versus his lap. Temperatures, here in Hungary, with the heat there is, the drivers keep looking at the temperature, not so much the engine temperature or the gearbox temperature, which they look as well. They look at the temperature of the tires, super important, and there are alarms. So the driver, when the temperature is getting too hot, the number, the reading changes color. So he can straight away see that he needs to drive in a way to keep the temperatures of the tires lower. So there's tire temperature sensors for every tire, brake temperature sensor as well. It's more important, the brake temperature, whether to know if the brakes are warm on Sunday before the race. And then also here, you know, there's not much time for the brakes to cool down, and the drivers keep also checking that the brakes don't get too hot, especially too hot. On the tires, sometimes you want to make sure they don't get too cold, because you lose risk, you lose grip. Too hot, also they may lose some grip. There's two types of rotary. This is the rotary you see later on with the steering wheel, that it's like this manettino, but this is also this type of rotary that goes up and down. Those ones, you use them a lot. They affect the balance of the car. The differential, very powerful, is how you want the rear tires locked, and that affects the understeer and oversteer of the car. So you have diff mid, that means for the medium speed corners, and that's down to the driver to decide how to adjust that. You have diff in, entry of the corners. SOC, that's something SOC. Probably you hear them talking about SOC 3, SOC 4, SOC 5. SOC stands for state of charge. How do you want to charge the batteries? If you charge them very quickly, they affect the braking of the car. Or for example, if the batteries are already fully charged, you don't want to charge them too much because they affect the balance of the car. So depending how they are charged and how do you want to affect the balance of the car, the engineers tell you now it's in SOC 5s, SOC 5. Those are the lights for the gear change, although the drivers have a beep. Sometimes you change gears based on a beep that goes on the radio. In the lower part tells you the battery level, how it's charged. In the middle there is the gear, which can be very useful. And all those rotaries here, the lower ones, we don't use them very much. They are more for the engine management. It's more the engineer telling the drivers to change them because you don't use them very much because to use them, and if you want to later on, you grab the steering wheel and you see that to use any of those, you have to remove your hand. So those are the ones we don't use very much. There are also buttons in the back, like the curves button, which normally what happens is, if this light goes green, that means you are within 1 second, and then in the lower, behind the steering wheel, there is a button which allows you to open the DRS. So all this functioning, you have to be able to do it without looking at the buttons, and we use the simulator to practice a lot. So the simulator in Maranello is very good to practice, let's say, the ergonomics, or the memorization, or you have to make it in a way that it's completely natural, changing buttons without having to look at them. So whenever they say the driver, do a function, and the driver doesn't find it, engineers get upset, because you should have studied that. You shouldn't look or even ask where the buttons are. This one as well, EB, engine braking. It's, or the brake balance, I think it's this one. It's just changing the brake balance forward or rearward. So if you lock the front wheels, you can move the brake balance forward or rearward.
So Mark, we see obviously F3, F2 and then up to F1. The cars from the outside look wildly different, but they get more advanced as you go up. And also the steering wheels. F2, we see some of the functions here on those steering wheels. Is the jump to Formula One now not just car performance, but also getting your head around this and making sure that you can master this over not just a single lap, but also in a race?
Yeah, but honestly the change, the steering wheels are different, so every team designed the steering wheel. The Ferrari steering wheel is completely different to the Red Bull steering wheel. In Formula 2, they are all the same. It's easier to drive a Formula 1 car in some respects. For example, the steering wheel is lighter. In Formula 1 you have power steering. In Formula 2 you don't have power steering. So I can tell you that on your arms is a lot more demanding the Formula 2 than the Formula 3, for sure, 100%. Having said that, mentally there's more work in Formula 1. There's a lot of multitasking in Formula 1, the drivers are really driving and every lap they are doing like 3 or 4 adjustments. In Formula 2 they don't think so much about that, there's not so much talk and changing settings or even adapting the setup of the car, so there's more tools in Formula 1 than there is in Formula 2, but physically Formula 2 is more demanding.
And let's talk about this circuit in particular. Hungary is obviously very, very hot. We've heard people refer to it, some of the drivers this weekend, as being like a big go-kart track, really. It is very, very tight, so it's demanding because of the heat, but how demanding is it in terms of steering wheel work, and how much would go on per lap in, let's say, qualifying versus the race?
Normally the adjustments they do, they are more or less the same. SOC, they always change, not every lap, but quite often. The diff, the way that works with the diff is the engineer says diff mid +2, suggestion. That means that the engineer is suggesting the driver, but it's down to the driver to do it. Because you are the one driving the car and you know if you really have understeer or oversteer. So whenever the engineer says a message, suggestion, you decide whether you want to do that, Having said that, the driver can change things without having to ask for permission. So if the driver wants to change the brake balance, doesn't have to say, I want to do this, what do you think, So brake balance, differential, the driver can do it straight away. Anything to do with this, for sure you should ask, because that will affect the engine management of the car. Tire temperature, normally is the engineers telling you tires are getting too hot, adapt to that. Sometimes the engineers also tell you lift and coast. Lift and coast means try to save some energy, not so much. Can be fuel, energy, and also can be lift before so you don't brake so hard, so the brakes are going to get a little bit cooler, So the lift and coast in this track, because of the heat management, The lift and coast helps on the brakes, helps on the engine. If before the straight you lift for a few meters and then you brake, there's less stress, there's less engine heat, and you can also bring the engine temperatures down.
Well, let's use that to talk about the session that we just saw, and obviously free practice 1 and 2 is going to be very hot and dry, but tomorrow we're all talking about the weather. It looks like we're going to have potential for big storms to come through. This race last year be affected so much, and that iconic start with Lewis Hamilton on his own, starting while we all changed back to slicks. Is that putting more pressure on free practice Friday because we won't have dry running?
Yeah, but actually what's happening is there is the theory, or there is the possibility that the rain may be so heavy tomorrow that qualifying may not take place. Which means, it's very unlikely, but that's something that I have heard this morning in the briefing. So if that's the case, there's two scenarios. The first one is that qualifying takes place today in the free practice 2. Free practice 2 sometimes can be the qualifying of the race. It's happened in the past. It's not the ideal scenario because Formula 1 would rather do qualifying Sunday morning in the past, you know. But however, I wouldn't be surprised if someone today in free practice 2 does really a qualifying simulation. That's a possibility. Another one then is qualifying takes place tomorrow in the wet, you know. And another one is qualifying tomorrow morning, you know. So there's 3 scenarios. Let's see which one. But anyway, rain tomorrow, yeah, for sure is expected.
Maybe that's what we saw. Now it's going to get quite noisy in just a second, but we saw Max Verstappen really put the car on the limit in that session. Was that potentially maybe looking at what the performance might be if qualifying, if they're going to take the order from the next session?
It will be more in free practice too. If that's the case, I would see some people doing really proper qualifying in the next session.
Alright, well, we're just about to get underway with Formula 3. It's going to get very, very noisy. Marc, thank you so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Marc Gene.